Good morning. Good morning. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's great. It's good energy on a Tuesday morning. I'm Lauren Reese, and together with my colleagues at the Wilson Center and our partners on today's event, WWF and ICCF, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's event on ocean policy to strengthen the resilience of marine ecosystems. For those of you joining the Wilson Center for the first time, I'll share a quick word about us. The Wilson Center is a think tank, a living memorial mandated by the U.S. Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. The center is home to 17 programs that focus on different regions or topics, including our Latin American program, Polar Institute, and China Environment Forum, which are co-sponsoring today's event. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, or ECSP, works to elevate environmental considerations in foreign policy, national security, and international development. Together, our programs are leveraging our global networks and topical and regional expertise to drive new conversations and action from governments and private industry on ocean policy, from the future of fisheries and contending with great power competition, IUU fishing and transnational crime, to stemming the plastic pipeline and encouraging marine protection. Our work recognizes that strong ocean policies are critical to effective foreign policy, which is why we are so delighted to be partnering with WWF today as we dive into Capitol Hill Ocean Week. In particular, I want to thank Andrew Wiley and Will Gartshore and Ben Freitas and the whole WWF team for their collaboration. In just a moment, I'll invite our panel to the stage, but first, it's my privilege to introduce Will Gartshore for opening remarks. Will is the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs at WWF. His efforts to educate and inform congressional members and staffers about priority conservation issues has had a marked difference on legislation and U.S. government funding for international conservation programs. And if you notice that Will's stage presence is better than my own, it's because he's been a professional actor for 20 years. So no pressure. Will, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. And thanks to everyone for joining us today, both here in the auditorium and online, and especially thank you to the Wilson Center for graciously hosting. So I'm Will Gartshore, Senior Director for Policy and Government Affairs at WWF. We're excited to have this panel of experts with us today to speak to some of the key challenges for our oceans and marine ecosystems, and to the policy work that WWF and partners like the Wilson Center and ICCF are engaged in to address them. So the oceans cover more than 70% of our planet, and they are critical to all life on Earth. That includes people everywhere, whether they live in coastal communities or 1,000 miles from the nearest seashore. The oceans supply more than half of the oxygen we breathe and provide food and livelihoods for billions of people worldwide. They are essential to both the global economy and global food security. They play a critical role in stabilizing the Earth's climate, absorbing 90% of excess heat and 40% of human-made carbon dioxide emissions, and they're home to much of our planet's biodiversity, containing an incredible array of species from the tiniest plankton to the largest creature that's ever lived on Earth, the blue whale. Because they are so vast for much of human history, the oceans often appeared indestructible, too big for us to break. But as we understand now all too well, that was never the case. In fact, our oceans find themselves in crisis due to centuries of overuse and neglect, with climate change now turning up the heat and threatening to push them to a dangerous tipping point. The rise in global carbon emissions has had dramatic impacts on the oceans, causing warming temperatures and increasing acidification that has resulted in mass coral bleaching events, melting ice caps, and rising sea levels. And these rapid changes to the ocean's physics and chemistry are undermining their ability to ensure a stable global climate and to support the species and societies that have evolved in them and around them. Of course, the clearest evidence of climate change is in the Arctic, which is warming nearly 4 times faster than the global average. There, the increasing loss of sea ice is creating a feedback cycle that is accelerating ocean warming, which is already causing dramatic impacts to Arctic ecosystems and communities. But it's not only at the poles where we already see dramatic changes taking place. The tropical oceans contain most of the world's coral reefs, which are home to more biodiversity than any other ecosystem and directly support over 500 million people. At current rates of warming, most coral reefs will cease to exist by the end of this century. And in coastal communities around the world that have long relied on the ocean's resources for nutrition and livelihoods, the migration of fish stocks into new regions due to warming waters is creating new food insecurities and increasing potential for regional conflicts over these shifting and dwindling resources. If we are to achieve the goal of conserving our oceans and their living resources, it is critical that we continue to develop and enact ambitious policies to reduce carbon emissions and halt climate change. And that's something that WWF has been working on for decades. And of course, we've seen really strong action and ambition from the current administration, but there's more that needs to be done on that front. At the same time, we need to be doing all we can to strengthen the health of our oceans and their resilience to climate impacts, while also maximizing their potential to provide climate solutions. To achieve this, WWF believes we need to advance policies that take a whole-of-ocean approach, including those that promote nature-based solutions, such as protecting and restoring mangroves, coastal wetlands, and other blue carbon ecosystems. For industries that depend on the ocean, like maritime shipping and ports, we need to promote innovation in their operations, including shifting vessels to zero-carbon fuels. And as new shipping routes open up and shipping traffic increases, particularly in the Arctic, government, industry, indigenous and local communities, and environmental stakeholders need to work together to manage the increased risks these activities pose to the Arctic environment and its communities. But given the climate impacts that we know are already coming, we also need to be doing all we can to reduce the pressures on marine ecosystems from other threats, including two that have been a particular focus for WWF: ending illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, known as IUU fishing, and working to reduce plastic pollution and prevent its leakage into nature, including our oceans. IUU fishing prevents one of the greatest threats to ocean health. Left unchecked, it will continue to drive overfishing and the depletion of fish stocks globally, undermining food security and national security, while also perpetuating forced labor and human rights abuses. To effectively address IUU fishing and forced labor in global seafood supply chains, WWF and its partners have advocated for strong policies that require traceability of all seafood, as well as transparency around fishing operations and activity at sea. As one of the world's largest seafood importers and consumers, the U.S. can use its market power to play a pivotal role in ending IUU fishing and human rights abuses in the seafood supply chain, by making strong standards for responsible management of fisheries a precondition for access to its markets. Last June, the President issued a memorandum on combating illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing and associated labor abuses that strengthens U.S. policies and tools to prevent IUU fishing and elevates the importance of combating labor abuses. Congress has also taken action in recent years, including passing the Maritime SAFE Act, which instituted a whole-of-government approach to countering IUU fishing and related threats to maritime security. More needs to be done, and WWF and its partners continue to advocate to strengthen and expand the tools the U.S. has to prevent IUU fishing, both to improve responsible and sustainable management of global fisheries that the U.S. sources from, and to ensure greater accountability and responsibility around labor practices in seafood supply chains. Plastic pollution is another serious and growing threat to ocean health. Every minute, a dump truck's worth of plastic waste enters our oceans, which adds up to millions of tons each year, threatening marine life as well as coastal livelihoods and human health. From production to disposal, plastic pollution harms our communities, our oceans, and our climate. It is a growing source of both toxic chemicals as well as greenhouse gas emissions. On the current trajectory, global emissions from plastics could be equivalent to roughly 300 coal-fired power plants by the end of this decade. At WWF, we have a vision for a world where no plastic enters nature by the year 2030. This vision requires not only recovery of plastic, but also the reduction of unnecessary plastic and a shift to sustainable inputs and new models, such as reuse. It also requires a global effort. The U.S. government has taken several important actions to address this problem, including the EPA's release earlier this spring of a draft national strategy to prevent plastic pollution, which would promote measures to reduce, reuse, collect, and capture plastic waste. But we are going to need more action at all levels, including by greatly improving recycling in this country. We need policies and incentives to standardize the upstream design for recyclability requirements, improve recycling and compost collection across communities and states, and shift more responsibility for recycling onto producers. We also need strong diplomatic leadership from the U.S. This past week, government representatives, business leaders, and stakeholders from all sides of the plastics issues met in Paris, France, for the second round of negotiations towards the creation of a global plastic treaty, which is expected to be finalized in 2024. WWF is advocating for an ambitious treaty that puts a particular target on the most high-risk plastics, those that are either most prone to leakage or cause the most harm once leaked. Through these ongoing negotiations, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to make a real difference and turn the tide on the plastic pollution crisis globally, including the harm it is doing to our oceans. We can't afford to let this chance slip away, and WWF will continue to push for the strongest possible outcome. Addressing such major threats as IUU fishing and plastic pollution will do much to take pressure off of our oceans and help them cope with a changing climate. So will enacting policies that help to protect and restore ocean ecosystems, make fisheries and aquaculture climate ready, support climate-smart tourism and recreation, and enhance the resilience of coastal areas and communities. Policies such as these also provide significant additional benefits, including new sustainable jobs, greater global food security, and of course protecting our planet's amazing and irreplaceable marine biodiversity. Achieving effective solutions that match the scale of the challenge facing our oceans requires forging strong and diverse partnerships, whether through the design and passage of new legislation, or the implementation of new rules by responsible authorities in the private sector, or action on the ground and on the water alongside the affected communities on the front lines. It is these communities, many of which are historically underserved and disadvantaged, that continue to pay the highest costs of climate change, and they must, of course, be central to our collective efforts. For our speakers today, we are lucky to have with us a set of partners working on diverse aspects of marine policy, all of whom are pursuing solutions that will help to strengthen the resilience of our oceans and reduce negative impacts of human activities on the water. So on behalf of WWF, I want to thank you all for agreeing to speak with us today, and thanks to all of you in the audience for joining for the discussion. And now I will hand it back over to our moderator, Lauren Reese, to kick off our panel. Thanks very much.
All right, so we have a pretty outstanding panel today, and we're going to keep it, they're each going to speak for a handful of minutes to get us started, and then we'll have a lot of time for discussion, and I hope that you'll bring your good questions to that discussion. I'm going to introduce them in order of the order that they'll be speaking in. Their bio, I'm going to keep their bios really short, like a sentence, but they have expanded bios. You can use the QR code, and for those of you watching online, you could just scroll down on your screen, and you'll see more extensive bios, and they all are bringing very diverse perspectives and expertise to this discussion and have a lot of really robust experience, which is worth diving into. Okay, so we're going to start with Delbert Pungawi, who is an Alaska tribal leader from the Siberian Yupik community of Sivunkak, or St. Lawrence Island in Alaska. After Delbert, we'll hear from Dr. Rebecca Pincus, who's the director of the Polar Institute here at the Wilson Center. After Becca, we'll hear from Carolyn Weiss, who's the program director for the International Conservation Caucus Foundation and Oceans Caucus Foundation. And then finally, we'll hear from Ryan Houlihan, senior policy lead for plastics policy at WWF, and he is supporting their No Plastics in Nature initiative. So Delbert, we're going to start with you. Can you share with us what your work looks like and what you're going to be doing here in DC this week, and sort of the history of your engagement on ocean policy?
I sit on the Alaska Community Action on Toxics, Alaska-based nonprofit organization, which we've been dealing with toxic pollutions, military toxic pollutions, for probably more than 30 years now. But I've been sitting with their working group for 10, 15 years, and been realizing that one of the biggest threats that, to me, the biggest threats that the Arctic faces is the toxic pollutions. The Arctic indigenous peoples are the most contaminated human beings on the planet. And there's a book I've been reading on my way here that inspired me to speak on this as well. It's titled Silent Snow by Marla Cohn. And it gives you a perspective of the indigenous tribes in Alaska, how we were the most healthiest humans on the earth to the most contaminated humans on the earth. And as you all know, from the scientists' reports that the global transport through the jet airstreams and the currents, all the toxic pollutions that's been accumulating in the Arctic since, especially since the Industrial Revolution began. But that's not just a threat to the indigenous tribes, it's a threat to all of humanity because it spreads everywhere. Through the oceans, through the currents. And one of the things that scientists have been worried about and concerned about for many years now, since they predicted the Arctic's loss of ice, where all this toxic pollution settles and just stays there. But as the climate is warming, the loss of ice that we're all witnessing today, the polar ice, the multi-year ice, the loss of unimaginable hundreds of, the loss of ice. And all that toxic pollution that's accumulated in the Arctic is going to become airborne again, and it's going to be transported all over the world. And so one of my big concerns is that we have this oceans thing that we're doing now. The Bering Sea's ecosystem is in serious trouble. We work very closely with NOAA scientist Rick Thoman, who is the lead scientist in Alaska, who's been researching the Bering Sea for probably over 4 decades now, and Lyle Brett. And I'm very proud and I really appreciate that NOAA scientists have learned to have the utmost respect for my people and to work with us very closely. And my people on the island, on St. Lawrence Island, original name is Sivokak. We've been working with the NOAA scientists for 30, 40 years every year, and they come and meet with our tribes, our leaderships, and in many cases they will report their findings to us before they put it out on press release. And so the one thing that they have learned to have the utmost respect for my people is that they tell us that because them working with us, they get to better understand what they're researching and to get a better, bigger picture of what they're researching. And so it is very important that our knowledge that's been passed on for thousands of years, since time immemorial, as my grandfather said it best, we were the first scientists, environmentalists, conservationists, all rolled into one. And so there are folks in our communities that say, well, we know our earth better than them. We know our environment better than they do. We don't need their to hear from them. But I explained to them, I'm a very good diplomat as well. and so I explained to them, yes, I do believe that we know our environment better than them. We know our animals better than they do. But they have the technology to find these toxic pollutions, and their predictions are equal to our knowledge. And so it's very important that we work together very closely to combine our knowledge together to combat what we're faced with. And so I'm very proud of that. That we're finally being heard, and our voices are coming out and being heard and respected. And according to my ancestral way, our belief, the 4 sacred brothers the white, the yellow, and the black and the red. We're one big family. And so we still believe in that belief of ours, our spiritual belief, and that I'm very proud of working with NOAA, and I thank you guys for inviting us and giving us the chance to voice our voices out for all of us, all our humanity and our Mother Earth.
Thank you, Delbert. Okay, I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes with some questions.
Okay.
But first, we'll go to Becca.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Delbert for those comments and for underlining the importance of a coalition approach to addressing the urgent environmental crisis and human crisis that we're facing in the Arctic region. And I think he put it more beautifully than I can. I'll try to sort of amplify his comments and maybe add a little bit about what the Polar Institute and the Wilson Center has been doing with WWF in the Arctic. And I'm going to talk fairly specifically about Bering Strait, because it's an area where we've been working together in partnership with Alaska Native communities, with industry, with government partners over several years, and I think made some great progress. And it really is, I think building off what both Will and Delbert said about the breakneck pace of climate change in the Arctic region and the really transformative changes that are taking place up there. It's transformative change happening really, really fast, not only in the physical environment, in the ecosystems of the Arctic, but also in the human communities that depend upon those ecosystems. And there's a lot of attention paid to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Arctic region has already warmed by 4 degrees, and there's parts of the region that are even past that. So the climate crisis is here and now in the Arctic region, and that's having real impacts. And second order effects like the re-release of toxic pollution that we've never really thought about, right? And I think Will spoke to this as well. There's the immediate climate crisis, and there's all these second order pressures. And I think that's something where WWF has made tremendous progress in the Bering Strait, which is facing really a double whammy right now. There's a double risk burden going on in the Bering Strait region, which is a narrow waterway connecting the Bering Sea, the North Pacific, up to the Beaufort, Chukchi, and Central Arctic Ocean. And that narrow choke point is a highway for marine life. It's spring migration season. So right now we have bowhead whales and gray whales and walrus and beluga and seals migrating through there. There's seabirds coming in, and the environment that they're arriving into, is changing rapidly. But it's also an area where there's significant increases of industrial traffic, because with the retreat of sea ice, there's greater potential for shipping in the Arctic Ocean, and the Bering Strait is a choke point for maritime shipping as well. So you can imagine this vital highway for marine life that's also suddenly filling up with ships, and those create additional burdens. So again, not only is the ecosystem changing because of warming, but there's more pollution, there's more noise, there's more hazards, ship strikes, potential for gear entanglements, and more potential for potentially catastrophic incidents. And so I think that's something where it can be really hard to craft a clear message, because when we're engaging with policymakers who have a million different things on their agenda, we don't want to muddy the message, right? And we don't want to say, stop thinking about climate change and start thinking about this other thing. We want them to think about both things at once, and that can be really tricky. And I think that's where it's been so great for me and the Polar Institute to partner with WWF for the last several years, because we have been, I think, very careful about crafting a message and communicating with policymakers, with industry partners, with community partners about the double whammy that's facing communities and ecosystems in the Bering Strait, and about proactive and really pragmatic ways that we can maybe adjust that risk burden. So obviously there's the big picture background efforts to immediately draw down carbon emissions and to bend the curve on climate change. But there's also some targeted interventions in the Bering Strait area that can reduce that other half of the risk equation. And that's things like dynamic shipping measures. So it's spring migration season. Maybe we put into place dynamic ship restrictions, speed restrictions, routing measures that are in response to migration season. They're spatially and temporally limited, so they don't have a really heavy industry impact, but they're sensitive to the most important places and times when those marine mammals are using those spaces. We can also think about vessel discharge rules. Right now, vessel discharge is a major source of pollution. Pushing those discharge spaces farther offshore, farther away from breeding and feeding areas is really tremendously important. There's discussion of the particularly sensitive sea area option, a PSSA designation for parts of Bering Strait. That's a pretty restrictive measure, but I think it's certainly worth exploring. WWF has been doing outstanding work on heavy fuel oil in the Arctic region. I think that's something we're really excited to continue working on. Banning and limiting heavy fuel oil in the Arctic will have important effects in the Arctic region specifically in terms of pollution and particulate matter and marine discharges, but it'll also obviously have net climate benefits as well. In addition, in the Arctic region, many areas have not been charted to modern standards. In some places, mariners are using charts from a century ago. And so we push NOAA and the Coast Guard and others to do more charting, do bathymetric scoping in the Arctic so that we can reduce the risk of maritime incidents associated with the lack of charting, right? And that's a no-brainer, right? That's a kind of example of a sort of low-cost intervention that could potentially head off a large incident. Something that I want to also draw a line under right now is the designation of ATBAs, the areas to be avoided. And this is something that WWF has been very successful working with the Wilson Center, working with the Coast Guard and others. In 2018, there was a joint US and Russian submission to the International Maritime Organization establishing shipping lanes in the Bering Strait and also 3 areas to be avoided. There's potential for more ATBAs to be designated, I think. And then, there's even more, I think, areas for potential cooperation. There's some novel ship propeller designs that reduce noise in ship functioning. And ship noise might seem like sort of peanuts, right, when we have this global climate crisis. But as Will was talking about, everything we can do to reduce pressures on marine ecosystems while we fight the climate battle, I think, is really important because some of those things can be done faster and lower cost. They're relatively sort of simple. So I think I'm optimistic, and I've really been impressed by WWF's effectiveness and coalition-based approach. I do want to say that we're at a really tricky time right now, though, and I'll just wrap up with about a minute on the broader geopolitical situation. And when I look at Bering Strait, obviously it's a US-Russia maritime border. And so for the last year and a half, following Russia's further invasion of Ukraine, that maritime border has been, there's been less cooperation and relations across it than there used to be. And it has always been difficult to partner with Russia in Bering Strait. It has been much more difficult in the last year or so. And that's true in the broader Arctic as well. So the Arctic Council has been impacted by the invasion. Climate science has certainly been impacted. Arctic communities, Bering Strait communities have been impacted. And so I think that's an ongoing challenge. And the work of NGOs, of think tanks, and of other non-governmental partners, I think is all the more vital right now so that we can keep work moving forward in the current context and be prepared to sort of move solutions ahead in creative and coalition-based ways that also incorporate traditional knowledge, indigenous traditional knowledge, and the sort of community bonds and strength that I think are so important in the Bering Strait region. It can be difficult to work across the strait right now, but we have families that straddle the Bering Strait, and I think they're sort of the first point of entry whenever things get better. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Becca. We're going to go to Carolyn next.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Carolyn Weiss. I am the program director for the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. acronym is ICCF, and we've kind of focused on the Arctic, and I'm definitely more of a bigger picture. So ICCF is a global organization. We work with legislatures all over the world, but our founding caucus was here in the U.S. And within the U.S., we have the International Conservation Caucus in the Senate and House, the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus, which is just in the Senate, and then the Oceans Caucus in the Senate and House, which is the work that I primarily do. So since we're here to talk about ocean policy landscape, I figured I would kind of go into what the Oceans Caucus has been interested in and focused on. On that note, bipartisanship is extremely important. So the Oceans Caucus doesn't focus on every piece of oceans legislation that it gets introduced. The policies and the solutions that I focus on and then the caucus co-chairs focus on are ones that both our Dem and our Republican are going to come in together. So that can be somewhat limited sometimes, but nonetheless has led to a lot of policy solutions that are actually introduced and passed, which is difficult these days. So I figured I would kind of, again, set the scene for traditionally a couple issues that I've worked on continuously throughout the multiple Congresses since I started in 2013. And then some trends that I'm seeing, and then maybe some hurdles that I've been put up against, and then I'll kind of take some questions. But so the caucus was started in 2011. Our foundation, which essentially serves as a secretariat, so I'm an extension of these co-chairs. So I do bring to them issues that our partners, including WWF and Wilson Center, are interested in to kind of make sure that they're looking at all the issues, but essentially I work for them. So I highlight their priorities, and so our foundation was created in 2012, and then I started in 2013. So a couple of the main issues that I've started since the beginning was IUU fishing, which Will touched on, and he also touched on the plastic pollution issue. And I will say since 2013, there's been some definite wins in that realm. So we've got the Port State Measures Agreement, which we're still trying to implement and help with capacity building through the U.S., but then help other countries implement. Then we have the Maritime Safe Act as well, and then we just had some more provisions passed in this recent NDAA. For plastic pollution, and you'll hear more from Ryan after me, but the Oceans Caucus back in 2016 started with the Save Our Seas Act, and that essentially just reauthorized the marine debris program through NOAA. But then the next Congress, they took a step further and passed the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act, which really got into, it created a marine debris foundation. It focused on recycling infrastructure. So EPA now provides some grants for recycling infrastructure. So I think there's definitely more work to be done there. And again, I'm sure you'll hear that from Ryan. And so this Congress, one of their priorities is drafting a Save Our Seas 3.0. So that remains to be seen what that will exactly look like. And again, we need to get both, so Senator Dan Sullivan and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse have been the ones that have traditionally worked together on that. And they have two very different political backgrounds and views. And so sometimes that can be tricky, but again, the result is typically something that's introduced and can really gain some bipartisan traction. So I was also, I think it sometimes feels like not much gets done on the Hill, especially in some of the issues that we work on. So I thought it would be worth, I'm not gonna go through everything that was included in the NDAA back at the end of 2022 and the omnibus, but just there were some key issues, the things that were included that I think are great, and especially there were a couple oceans wins, including the Blue Globe Act, which Senator Whitehouse and Murkowski spearheaded, as well as the Coast Research Act, which our co-chair in the House, Congresswoman Bonamici, spearheaded, and those both deal with kind of ocean data and observation. So we have ocean data, observation, exploration, where there are definitely some key pieces in the NDA included. Coastal ecosystems, resilience, and coral reefs were also included. We had the some maritime transportation and infrastructure, some fisheries provisions, and then there were, again, some additional IUU fishing provisions included as well. So there are some things, there are things that are happening. Unfortunately, like one of the trends I'm seeing is that it's getting harder and harder to get members to focus, well, not focus, but prioritize oceans issues all at the same time, which would lead to maybe a hearing and a markup and a vote and then passed on its own. Whereas you're seeing things like that similarly that happened at the end of 2022 was that everything gets dumped in a must pass bill. And so I don't necessarily see that trend changing, unfortunately, for this Congress, and that remains to be seen what happens next Congress. I do think that's somewhat troublesome just because, again, it doesn't get the attention it deserves, and then what ends up sometimes happening too is that some of the essential parts of the bill get stripped out to make a member happy, and then it gets watered down. So that's something that I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. I think that, so let me see here. I think what we're seeing, so I talked about the IUU fishing and plastics, marine debris, kind of pollution issues that have been prioritized. Another big trend I'm seeing that really started last Congress and has continued this Congress is the ocean data and observation. So especially as you've been hearing in the Arctic, some of the things that are happening, we don't really understand. We don't have baseline data to really compare. And so that makes it really difficult to understand the changes and then to be able to effectively manage. So we are seeing, and when I say trends, I'm meaning bipartisan interests. So we are seeing both Democrats and Republicans really starting to show support for programs and funding through NOAA and other agencies and reports on impacts of ocean acidification, maritime spatial planning, ocean exploration has been a big one, even among the Republicans, and then nature-based solutions. So coastal resilience efforts, blue carbon projects, the lunch briefing that the Oceans co-chairs wanted for the Chow Hill Week that you all are here for today is on ocean carbon dioxide removal. So looking at the technology developments there and the opportunities and what role the ocean could play in carbon sequestration and helping with mitigating climate impacts, which, you hear a lot about that with forests. That was kind of a big one last Congress, and the opportunities there for carbon sequestration and mitigating climate impacts. But the ocean has been doing it way before, well, not way before forests, but it's the biggest, carbon sink we have and has really been, is our big kind of weather and climate mitigator. So those are big trends, and those are continuing, and I think they will continue. I mean, I think some of the main bills that have come out have been around weather forecasting, ocean data and exploration, like I said, coastal acidification. So there's been a number of bills introduced on that already, and you're seeing the Senate counterparts coming as well. So I'm definitely confident. One thing I will say, as you're and you're working with your stakeholder groups and reaching out to Congress, one thing I mentioned earlier was that when you start to have these bills that get dumped in these bigger packages, they get watered down, and that's kind of, I think we're past, especially with issues like IUU fishing and plastics, we're past we don't need another working group. We don't need another report in 5 years. There's a lot of language that's been passed in these bills recently, and I'm thinking of Maritime Safe. There's all these capacity language building, language for implementing port state measures abroad and helping other countries enforce their waters and their fisheries management. So there's a lot of language out there, but the implementation and the actual authorities and appropriations are the things that get stripped out to make everyone happy. And I think we need to really start looking at those opportunities and looking at programs that need to be funded and countries that need to be helped and prioritized. And so I think that's kind of one of the biggest hurdles that I see. And unfortunately, especially with some of the House rules that are in place in terms of not they're not allowing any additional funding. If you're going to propose a bill or introduce a bill that has additional funding, you have to say where you're cutting. And no one likes cuts. So it's a very tricky scene. But I think that's something we always need to keep in mind to make sure that we're looking at the solutions we're passing and making sure that the implementing portions are still there, or at least being discussed and brought up and not forgotten, because especially on the Hill, it's so fast-paced, and you want to pass a bill, you want to get the headline, and it's really important to kind of look back at what's been passed, and that's the hard part. That is one of the hard parts, so let's take advantage of some of the language that's already there. And then I will say, one thing I kind of had here, oceans issues on a number of levels are bipartisan. I think a concerning trend I'm seeing is that, and this has definitely been true on the West Coast anyways, but a lot of coastal districts are all blue. So we're starting to see that the coasts are going blue where the red is going in the center. And I think it was just a trend worth noting. I'm not sure what that necessarily means for oceans, but I hope that we can continue to collaborate with Republicans and make sure that they understand that these issues are relevant to them. And so that's, I think, was just something I noted to kind of for us to start thinking about. And maybe it's, making sure they're in the relevant committees and hearing from us stakeholders. But yeah, so I'll pause there, and then we can go back to Ryan, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Great, thanks, Carolyn.
Awesome.
Ryan.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ryan Houlihan, and I'm the Senior Policy Lead for Plastic Policy at World Wildlife Fund. I'd like to start today by thanking the Wilson Center for hosting us. It's an incredible honor to be participating in today's panel during Capitol Hill Oceans Week. I'm excited to talk plastic policy today because plastic policy is ocean policy, and the health of our oceans are at stake. It's estimated that 11 million metric tons of plastic waste enters our oceans every year. That's equal to a dump truck every single minute, as Will said in his remarks. And it comes in a myriad of forms, from takeout containers to toothbrushes to toys to fishing gear. The list could go on. This affects 800 species around the globe through ingestion and habitat loss. At the current rate we are heading, our new plastic production is set to double, and the amount of plastic leaking into our oceans is set to triple in less than 20 years. This rate of plastic production is unsustainable. The stakes are really too high to make a change now and to do it fast. To reduce the demand on our planet and stop the flow of plastic into our oceans, we must rebuild to a more circular system where material flows through a closed system. At WWF, our vision is to have no plastic enter nature by 2030. That might sound like a rather ambitious goal, and that's because it is. We set the bar for ambition high on purpose, because anything less will not be effective in solving the plastic pollution crisis on the scope and scale that our planet needs. To meet the moment, we need to fix the broken and complex system that has gotten us to where we are today, from the high demand on unnecessary virgin plastics to ineffective waste management. And we're going to need everyone on board, from policymakers to industry leaders, from cities to individual consumers, to do their part so the plastics we discard can become the plastics we use again. There's a shared ambition here. Now we need a shared action. That action being smart plastic policy on both the national and global levels to enable the frameworks that allow voluntary initiatives to be more impactful. Within the United States, there's an ongoing push for a national policy on extended producer responsibility. In our current linear economy, the production and use of materials is completely disconnected from their environmental, social, and economic impacts. Virgin materials are often cheaper than recycled materials, creating no incentive for the uptake of recycled content. Extended producer responsibility, or EPR as is commonly known, is a policy approach that shifts the financial responsibility for managing the end-of-life disposal of a product from the government and taxpayers to the producer of the product. As a result of continued advocacy from corporate leaders as well as NGOs and other stakeholders, Colorado enacted the United States' first extended producer responsibility legislation last June. Colorado is now leading the nation in implementing EPR for all packaging, That will make collection easier for consumers, incentivize best practices for sorting and processing, and pair producer responsibility with access to high-quality materials. As with extended producer responsibility, another policy option could change the way we rely on materials. DRS, deposit return systems, or more commonly known as bottle bills, assign a refundable value to packaging that is returned to consumer when the package is collected. 10 states have existing DRS systems for beverage containers, and a national DRS proposal is currently being developed on the Hill. The establishment of a national DRS could be a model for successful material management at scale while stimulating investment in existing recovery streams and creating the infrastructure needed to improve both recycling and reuse efforts. It can also set the groundwork for larger producer responsibility models where producers are accountable for the materials they use, aka EPR. Now, national policy alone will not solve the problem. Our oceans don't adhere to state lines, and neither can our solutions. If we're going to tackle this issue at scale, we need countries around the world to rally together for a solution. Last week, the second negotiating meeting for the forthcoming UN Global Treaty on Plastic Pollution commenced in Paris, France. 175 signing countries gathered to debate what will go into this treaty. While it was a challenging week for collaboration, it ended in a good place. Ultimately, INC2 was a success in that it made tangible progress towards reaching an agreement between states, including improving a mandate for a zero draft of the treaty. As we continue negotiations for the Plastic Pollution Treaty this fall in INC3 in Nairobi, Kenya, it will be critical to build international alignment and maintain healthy communication and strong collaboration. A successful treaty must target the most high-risk plastics, the plastics that are either most prone to leaking into nature or causing the most harm once leaked. This includes single-use plastics, which represent the largest portion of ocean plastic leakage by weight, fishing gear, which is the deadliest form of plastic pollution for marine wildlife, and microplastics, which are entering the ocean at such a rapid rate, they make up 20% of all ocean plastic leakage, despite their small size. Additionally, we need an internationally agreed-upon method for calculating discharge rates by country. By establishing these metrics in a harmonized agreement, we can establish a universal baseline for progress. Without this common framework, we're limiting our ability to problem solve at the speed and scale needed. The United States and all partnering countries need to keep our ambition high, because anything less will not put an end to this global crisis that is threatening our wildlife, our communities, our climate, and our oceans. Together, we have not only the opportunity, but the responsibility to make a difference. And yeah, thanks for your time today, and excited to dive in the conversation.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
You guys did an amazing job. I mean, oceans is a huge issue, right? Like physically, and then sort of all these different aspects of it. And I think each of you bring a really important perspective and diverse insights that are actually, there's some common threads across, right? One of the themes that came out is sort of this need for collaboration and cooperation and coalition building, as Becca called it. And I wanted to dive into each of the different topics that you're working on and what that might look like, and where you've seen, like what's worked, right, to build those collaborative mechanisms, and where the hurdles are and what's needed to sort of overcome those hurdles. And Delbert, I wanted to start with you. You know, you mentioned your cooperation with NOAA, right? Mm-hmm. And that you've been 30 to 40 years, right? That you've been working together. And could you share with us what that relationship building looked like, and how did you build that trust on the community side? You did mention that to a small extent, but then also on NOAA's side, how did you get them to recognize the value that your knowledge brings to their own work, and how do you develop those relationships so that they go on beyond the individuals, right? You have your individual relationships, but how do you institutionalize it so that it can be long-lasting?
Okay. First of all, I feel like I did not properly introduce myself, if I
Please.
may. Kung ipigastun at katunikat iyang lalorm kastun at katunikat Albert Pangawi. Kung mataka kung kiwamit yukat nga. Mataka kung masingam ta nunalwit kat nga. My Yupik name is iyang, my English given name is Delbert Pangawi. I am of the Kewalmi clan. I'm the sovereign, a tribal member for my sovereign Masinga Nation. And I just like to declare our nations, although we're not recognized internationally, that indigenous sovereign tribal nations exist in this world. And indigenous sovereign tribal nations matter. And so my undeniable proof beyond a reasonable doubt is I sit here before you speaking. And so I was born in 1959. My eyes opened to the world when I was 3 years old. And we had no electricity. Stove oil heaters were just being introduced. We were still on dog team. Winters were long and harsh. 9 whole solid months of winter. There's 2 types of winter that we believe we knew of. When it wintered extremely cold and harsh, 60, 70, 75 below zero, it is called Yuoluni Uksukto, wintered as a man. When we have mild winters, it is called Aganaluni Uksukto, wintered as a woman. And so, and we have many different types of names for the ice. The multi-year ice that the scientists call the polar ice, that's been around since the last ice age, in our language is called Gulushik. Gulushik. It's literally translated as mother ice. Another name we call it is Sikupiuk. Siku is ice. Sikupiuk is the real ice. And so I wanted to introduce myself in this way so you can have a better perspective of who I am and where I'm coming from. Yeah, the Bering Sea is in serious trouble. As you question how we got to work with NOAA scientists. Of course, they're doing the researches in the Bering Sea, and they have to do researches in a close proximity of our islands too. So they had the respect to meet with our local leaderships, our tribal councils, and to explain to us what their researches are and how they do it. They grid out 30 miles per 30 miles in the Bering Sea, and each location is marked, and they check the bottom of the ocean, its health. And so, and they, from talking with us, they, as I mentioned, that we were able to help them understand what they're researching more in depth, and for them to see the bigger picture. And I'm very proud of that we have formed an alliance with each other. I believe that, for example, in 2018, they had what shocked them when they did a finding. Before they did the press release, they had a teleconference with our tribal council to let us know what their findings were. And I was very impressed with that we were informed before the press released it. It was the cold curtain that south of our island, or maybe 100 miles south of our island, lifted. That separated the northern Bering Sea and the southern Bering Sea. There's a cold pool that the cods and other species that thrive in that colder waters. And pollock fishery, the biomass, $2 billion a year, or some billions of dollars a year, commercial fishery, biomass that was south of our island, over 100 miles south of our island. And in that 2018, their finding was they were shocked. The cool curtain was not there anymore. And the biomass was not there anymore. So they went and looked for it, and they found it I don't know how many miles north of Gamble. And they were big adults. And they, with one scoop, a 50 foot wide, 50 foot long scooper, they sink it down to the bottom and scoop it for 15 minutes. And they had it filled up. They showed it on their pictures and their videos that they did, and they checked their stomach contents where they were eating worms, not their normal diet. And so, and the blue cod and the tomcod that was a little bit north of us, the biomass wasn't there anymore. So I told them, you have to go further north where you'll find cold water, you'll find them there. And they did. And so in 2018, I was invited to speak in London by Friends of the Earth and for the annual UN-IMO International Maritime Organization meeting. The purpose of that trip was to get the UN and the IMO for the ships that's going through the Arctic and subarctic not to use the heavy fuel oil anymore. And I had a crash course education on that. It's very toxic, bottom of the barrel fuel. And when they burn that, the pollution lands on the ice and the snow. It helps it melt faster. The petroleum byproduct, and to phase it out and ultimately ban it. And they, October 22nd to the 26th, they had that meeting and they discussed it. There was 9-10 nations that were wanting to hold off on it, about the same amount, pushing to pass the resolution for the ships not to use and ultimately phase it out and ban it. And I was very thankful that they had timed it to where we had to speak one at a time. They let us speak one at a time before 173 nations, and then the second day they had us panel, all 4 of us. And during that time they were discussing that resolution that was submitted by Finland, how to phase it out and ultimately ban it. And like I said, there was 9 or 10 nations that were wanting to hold off on it. At the same time, there was 9 or 10 nations that were pushing to do it. And at that time, when I was speaking, I was stressing the urgency of the matter, that they need to take action today and not tomorrow. And so they timed it to where they had us speak one at a time, and then all 4 of us at Elder from Uktiavik, George Edwardson, Edward Zador from Russia, Chukotka, who lives in Fairbanks, and sadly and painfully, my nephew, Mr. Werner Wilson, who was the Friends of the Earth that he worked there, that put our belt to there. He had an unfortunate accident and passed away recently. But I had to shed a few tears that time at that meeting. That I felt like we were not received very well at first. You know, we were kind of like, hi, okay. But by the time we got done with them, they could look at us in our eyes and shake our hands and thank us for being there to share our knowledge and to speak with them. But anyway, I'm sidetracking again. After the second time we paneled, and after that they put it to the vote, and I was very impressed, amazed at how they voted was through their alliance. You know, Finland was pushing hard on it, and the U.S. was alliancing with Finland. I was very proud of that, hopeful, and so that's how they voted, was through the alliance. You know, they declared their nation and then their alliance, and it swept across the room. And I got chills down my spine. I had to shed a few tears. That overwhelming majority supported it and passed it. And I was very thankful for that. And many of them came to us and thanked us for. One of them said that you guys pushed it over the hurdle.
Yeah.
And so that was a very humbling experience. I'm very proud of that.
That's wonderful, Delbert. I mean, I think that underscores the importance of having those voices who are living in these communities, who have this, knowledge and have these, like the resiliencies and the perceptions of the risks that are being faced and what matters, right? How these international level discussions and decisions really matter, and having that, having you show up in the room is of immense value. So thank you. Becca, I think, you talked about coalition building and crafting the message, and I think your point about second and third order effects, and there's the ones that we know about and there are ones that we don't know about, right? So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see that, you've been at DoD before, you've been at the Coast Guard, you're here at the Wilson Center now, you're working across what we call at the Wilson Center the scales of decision making, right? You're working with local communities all the way up to these sort of international forums, and how you see the importance of bringing different stakeholders to the table to help craft that message, and where you've seen really, significant progress, but who's still missing maybe from the conversation, or how we bring them in a more meaningful and intentional way.
Sure. Thank you. I think, first, maybe I'll share an example of some really great positive work. And I think the Wilson Center, the Polar Institute, has been working with WWF, as I mentioned, in Bering Strait, and around reducing the risks of maritime shipping to get at that sort of double risk burden I alluded to earlier. And one of the novel ways that we've been working together is not only working with federal partners like the Coast Guard or NOAA, not only working with local communities like the communities on St. Lawrence Island and elsewhere in the Bering Strait, but also bringing in some novel partners. So, for example, thinking about where the industry interests lie in Bering Strait. Certainly, there are some industry interests that don't want to see additional regulation, but there are other industries that might find that appealing. And so, for example, talking with the insurance industry, because insurers don't want to see ships have incidents because they will have to pay out, right? And so how can we work with the insurance industry? And there's been some really, I think, fantastic work in this area around information. Insurers and ship owners who are often very far away from the locations where their ships are operating want more information. They always want to know what's happening with their ships. And so vessel tracking not only is good for insurers, it's good for ship owners, it's good for those of us who want to see vessels operate safely. Because if you can track a vessel, you know if it's going along recommended routes, you know if it's going too fast or too slow, if it stops unexpectedly, maybe it's having some kind of problem, if there's been some kind of reported, if there's an animal sighting, whale sighting, or some other sort of sensitive area, you know if the vessel is obeying that area restriction or not. So getting information out and sharing it among stakeholders is something that can be in our common interest and can help build new relationships. And if you're tracking vessels, you can respond earlier when you know they're in trouble. And vessel operators, if they know they're sort of being watched, will probably behave better, right? And so I think there's been some terrific actors in Alaska. I'm thinking of the Alaska Marine Exchange, which is a really innovative nonprofit structure that works with fishing boats and other vessel operators to help them comply with regulations. And that reduces their costs, improves their bottom line and reduces the burden on the U.S. Coast Guard because there's fewer incidents that the Coast Guard then has to respond to. So thinking about information sharing as a way of achieving the goals that we're after and addressing the interests of all the various stakeholders, I think, is a really sort of novel approach. And WWF is working to build upon this platform through more information sharing tools, like a dynamic port guide, right? So every mariner and ship captain will get a operating guide to a certain area. That guide can be electronic. It can be updated with up-to-date information about charting, weather conditions. It could potentially include information about marine mammals. That's something that has to be done in close cooperation with coastal communities that may be subsistence hunting those marine mammals. But if we share information, we can hopefully reduce risks, and I think that brings in some new partners. In terms of the sort of gaps in the system, again, we're talking about an area in close proximity to Russia. And so there's sort of a really challenging gap over there. And also there's increases of Chinese shipping in the Bering Strait and the Arctic for natural reasons. Obviously, China is a maritime power. It's the largest shipping nation in the world. And so I think mobilizing internationally to sort of bend the curve on Chinese and Russian participation in international fora like the IMO, some of the other international law structures that pertain to the oceans and the Arctic. Obviously, they're both UNCLOS signatories, so we have a great foundation there. But I think that's tremendously important. And given the geopolitical context, that's going to be really important, I think, for the next several years. Thanks.
That's great. Well, that's a great lead-in to Carolyn. I think you could arguably say that you have the hardest job of anybody up here. And thinking about, I think Delbert's point about the what happens in the Arctic is not, Becca, a lot of your work is like what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, right? Delbert, you illustrated that what happens in the rest of the world really matters for the Arctic, right? In terms of human health and environmental conditions. As we're seeing playing out. Carolyn, so you talked about some of the, you have coastal states in the U.S., but what we're all talking about here today really matters for those other states as well, right? And so what could people in this room and watching online do to make your job easier, right?
Definitely talk to your members. So I'm not sure, obviously, what states everyone represents in districts, and Ryan can speak to this too. Sometimes I have trouble, even members of my caucus, getting meetings with them unless I'm from their district or from their state. And so I think some people feel very far removed from the Hill and their members, but it's not true. I mean, they have people on staff that are dedicated to responding just to their constituents. So I would say if there's issues that you care about, make sure that your policymakers know. And I don't really work with the state and local legislatures, but there's a role for them to play as well, especially in the waste management plastics conversation. Mm-hmm. And so I think, for me, stakeholders are obviously very important. And the first thing I do when I have my members coming into town, or we have a council that we have, and they help us kind of tell us what issues are going on or what issues are important to them.
Sorry to interrupt. Who's on the council?
So that was going to be my next. We've got a whole list of partners, but they come from the communities. They come from our industry, NGOs, and we have some university partners. And then again, we really do depend on our diplomatic community here in DC, because we do have caucus and legislators around the world. So the stakeholders are very important to me. I will say one of the main things I'm constantly doing is definitely trying to get stakeholders heard and members of Congress to care about things. But you'd be surprised at how much they're kept out of the loop. And so I see this very much in our caucuses abroad. So we've talked a little bit about some of the administration treaties that get passed, or like a Biden National Security Memorandum, or the IUU Fishing Action Alliance that was created in Portugal last year. there aren't any legislators there. And half the time these conferences are held during times when Congress is in session. So even if you wanted to invite them to participate, they can't. So that's not just for US, but for countries that these conferences are held in. I launched a Oceans Caucus in Indonesia back when Indonesia hosted Our Oceans Conference. And it was an interesting practice because I was there in Jakarta to launch this Oceans Caucus, and then the next week was Our Oceans Conference, and the co-chairs of the caucus had no idea what I was talking about. So in their own country, they had Our Oceans Conference with leaders from across the world to come and talk about ocean solutions, and they didn't even include their own legislative body, which is where these things get implemented. So, we do often talk about stakeholders and their engagement in being heard from Congress, but I think it's something that gets left out.
Is that a capacity, is it a technical, they sort of having that knowledge internally of how to pull the right levers and how to have the right people in the room, and is that something that ICCF or the Oceans Caucus?
We try.
Okay.
We definitely have tried, and that's been one thing that we've tried to focus on, especially, again, when working with our caucuses abroad, if we know that they're hosting some conference. And I can't keep track of them anymore either. There's a ton of conferences all the time on solutions, which is great, but it can be hard to really get legislators to be a substantial part of the conversation. So I think it's important for us to just keep that in mind. And I don't think it's a matter of them not listening or not caring. I have a lot of members who I talk to, and they're all gung-ho about an issue. But the amount of things pulling at their schedules is insane. I have members when I'm planning stuff that they literally have from 9:37 to 9:39, they'll be at your event. That's tough. That's real tough. And so it's a tricky balance, and it is very hard. It is very hard. And so I think, especially since the pandemic, the Hill's changed a little bit. And so I haven't nailed down the perfect solution actually at this point. I'm still trying out a bunch of different tactics to see what sticks, but it's definitely tricky.
Great. Ryan, the plastics issue is like Carolyn was saying, it's one that sort of goes across land and ocean, right? Are there particular innovations or investments that you think are just kind of getting primed, right? That we need to be pushing forward?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think two of the big ones right now that are at the state level and nationally are what I talked about previously, extended producer responsibility, which is a huge one. And that's been, there's been, I can't remember how many, probably 10 or so, maybe more, bills that were introduced at the state level this year. Colorado passed last year, which was exciting news. So we're keeping track of that. And then also the deposit return systems. I think that's huge policy. They're already in 10 different states, and there's DRS systems all throughout Europe right now that have been successful models for us to look at. I think when you're talking about collaboration, DRS is something where at the national level, I know right now on the Hill, they're working on a national bill for DRS. And to kind of form that model, they're using the examples from the different state level programs we have. So taking the best practices from every state and kind of forming them into one bill, which I think is probably the best way, the best way that we can do it possibly. I think at the state level and at the local level, they're really the laboratories when it comes to policy, and especially when it comes to recycling, plastics, and waste management policy. You can take different models that are working well in other parts of the country and kind of form your policy from there. And so I think we've been working a lot on the Hill with our partners to kind of be in the room while they're forming some of this policy and push some of these best practices. We also been working at the local level with organizations like the Recycling Partnership. We're doing a lot of great work in local cities and local communities in order to push best practices and give good outreach and resources to local cities and communities, and also pushing up organizations who are doing great work within their communities. There's one in Durham, North Carolina, called Don't Waste Durham, and they're they've managed to install reuse systems in different restaurants throughout Durham. And so we're able to highlight their work and kind of push that forward. And then I think globally and internationally right now, there needs to be a lot of collaboration at that level. We saw last week at INC2, there was kind of a breakdown of communication between countries. And I think it showed the need for collaboration at that level and the need to push for high ambition going forward continually. I'd say like half the week probably was left with just people arguing about procedural rules, which led to kind of a stalling of the work that we could have gotten done there. So there's definitely a need for collaboration at that level as well.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me that you talked about your high ambition, right? So no plastic entering nature by 2030, and that is a high bar, but every year it's just gonna get higher, right?
Yes.
Like we're sort of, so that's,
That's like the thing about it. And
Yeah.
at the end of the day, the fact that some of these countries are hesitant about what we're asking them
Right. It's
to
just-
agree to reflects well on our level of ambition, because that's the level that we need to have. And it's not easy to ask, but we gotta aim high.
yeah.
So
I'm going to open it up now to questions, and we have a couple of mics in the room. So what I'll ask is that you raise your hand and wait for a mic to be passed to you, and then give us your name and your affiliation before getting to what is hopefully a brief question or comment in the form of a question. Okay, why don't we go ahead and start with the man here with the striped shirt. Thanks, Angus.
Hello. Thank you for your presentations. I think they were very complimentary.
Can you
and
give us your
interesting.
name and your affiliation?
Of course, I was getting to it.
Okay, sorry.
My name is Manuel Carmona, and I work here in DC as counselor for environment, oceans, and the Arctic at the European Union delegation to the U.S. In Washington Circle. Now, so I represent the European Union in all environment, Arctic, and ocean issues here. Try to engage with the U.S. as much as we can. In that, I was very interested to hear about some legislation doing the rounds on Save Our Seas 3.0, crucial. We've seen the two early iterations, and also possibly the deposit return system, a national bill. We have in the European Union a circular economy action plan. You probably heard about that a lot in Paris. My colleagues were in the INC2 from the European Commission. My interest was particularly to know what's going to happen with these two pieces of legislation that Ryan and Caroline mentioned. Ryan, you have expanded a bit more on where we're going, but I would like to hear from Save Our Seas 3.0. You know, who's in charge, who's doing the work, so that we could engage as European Union trying to crucially have transatlantic markets and operations that are as smooth as possible, because this involves also our trade colleagues. Thank you.
That's great. Let's take a couple more questions and then we'll come back to the panel. Yeah, Angus, Daniele, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. My name is Daniele. I'm an environmental health specialist, and I work at Fiocruz, that is a research institution from the Brazilian Ministry of Health. I thank you so much for the presentations. I have a lot of things in my head, and I would like to raise the awareness that ocean pollution is also a public health issue, and we should use more this information to bring more compelling information. And like Delbert said, that we have the transportation of many toxic chemicals around the world, from the continent to very far places that were not even have the contact with that chemicals in the first time. And we already have a lot of research showing the effects on these communities, like the Inuits, the Faroe Islands. And we also have now not now, but the plastic is also a second thing that make it more complicated, because we are seeing that microplastic can transport genes that are resistant to antibiotics, and we can find these genes in polar area. Fiocruz has a lab in Antarctica, and we also already found like virus that came from the continent in penguins, in puddles, in the middle of the ice. So we are transport all these pathogens and pollutions across the ocean, and I think we need to work together so we can raise this problem and also make more compelling all this fight against pollution. But my question today is, we think that technology probably will solve all our problems, and we are seeing that technology has been pushing, and we need mine and also metals for that. And we are seeing a lot of projects regarding to mining in the oceans. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about this project, and how the new agreement of the deep sea can working on to stop this kind of project?
Okay,
If
great.
we need to stop it, I think so.
Thank you, Daniele. Okay. Another question up here. Right here.
Peggy Noss from an inland state, but very water-dependent Minnesota, a partner member of WWF. My question is to bring it down maybe to our own moral decision-making. So given the maritime shipping risks and noise pollution, fuel, as well as human waste.
Sorry, I think the mic got somehow turned off or stopped working. Angus, can you bring up the other mic real quick? Just for our online audience, they need to be able to have a mic. There you go. Thank you.
I hope I didn't turn it off.
No.
So given maritime shipping risks and noise pollution and other pollution from the loss of multi-year ice, should we be tourists on the increasing cruise ship traffic across the northern seas and through the straits and visit St. Lawrence Island or not?
Okay, great question. I think I'm going to ask you to have real quick answers, and then we'll go for one more round before we. Oh, I didn't see that. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, my name is Tom Anderson. I'm from a state where I'm having a difficult time because the state I live in, the word woke is a dirty word.
Mm-hmm.
And I look around, I see all these W's in front of me. And it's been somewhat, and also with the other thing that's kind of interesting is, if you know a little bit about Woodrow Wilson, I don't think he'd want a blue background in today's world. But the thing, I have a thank you for you, and I have a question for you. I've always been interested in behavioral modification. I've done some work over the years with it, and I found that it's very difficult to change an ideology with facts. And today, at home, I'm pretty conscientious about my biases, my prejudices, and my lifetime. I've worked on them. And at home, I usually have a water bottle. And today, I wanted to buy some water coming over here, so I bought this. And I thought, holy shit, what did I just do coming in front of this thing? But I want to thank you for reminding me about some of the prejudice that we all hold, and we try to work through them. And the difficulty, we just react and we don't think. And that's kind of what I did today. I didn't react. I just thought I wanted a bottle of water, and I pay attention to it a lot. And my question is, really what we're dealing with in the political world is that we're trying to institute change, behavioral change. And you can do it with economies and so forth, the scale and so forth. But the reality, what are you doing when you work in the political projects to make people aware of the facts that you got to get through the ideology with facts? What are you doing to make them change their minds so they see, like this guy hanging the bottle of the plastic water going, duh. What do you do to make that change apparent? How do you make them aware of the fact, especially old people like me? You know, we're conditioned. We've been around a long time. We've got a lot of conditioning that we've got to get through to make the changes that we need to make the world work. So my question again is, what are you doing from a behavioral modification standpoint? You're trying to institute the change to make the people aware of it. You know?
So a small question for our.
Sorry.
No, it's a great question. Okay, so Ryan, why don't we start with you and
Yeah.
Carolyn with the Save Our Seas 3.0 question.
I know less about Save Our Seas 3.0 right now. We're definitely trying to be part of the discussion right now. I think it's just
very early.
it's rumors on the hill right now, very early, but have not been in communication with those offices. But we want to be at the table and a part of that discussion. As far as DRS national legislation goes, Senator Merkley from Oregon is leading that effort right now. It's in draft form, and he's bringing multiple stakeholders to the table right now to draft it. They're looking to make a bill that's going to fit, that can be adaptable for the entire nation, which means like you kind of have to. It's taking a long time to draft it, and it's gone through so many different forms right now because something that works in Texas and more rural parts of the area, more rural parts of the country is not going to work for, let's say, Maine.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to find a way to make it adaptable, but also make it so that states who want to be a little bit more ambitious can also adapt and set those goals for themselves. But right now, it's only in a draft form, but we're working to get there. So yeah.
Okay, so for Save Our Seas 3.0, he's right, it is in very early stages, which I think is exciting opportunity. So if you would like to reach out to the Senator Whitehouse, Senator Sullivan teams on some ideas, that would be great. On that point, though, I'll invite you, next week we're hosting a circular economy workshop with 2 panels, one being with industry, and Thomas Brennickmeyer, who you might recognize that name, is joining us too on some Hill meetings to talk to members on how they could implement more circularity into some language in a Save Our Seas 3.0. So it remains to be seen specifics on that. But our panels next week are how industry is implementing some more circularity within their own supply chains, business practices, business consumer relations. And then the second panel's on the UN Plastics Treaty, and Ryan's colleague is going to be moderating that with the UN, State Department, and Mars.
Are those publicly available? Like
Yes.
online? Okay, so maybe
Well,
we can add a link.
Yeah,
to the
I will
page.
share the link. I will say if you're not going to be in DC, we're
Okay.
we don't have the fancy Wilson Center capabilities. It is in person, but if you're in DC, I would love for you to join, and we'll make sure that that link gets dispersed. So we also have a caucus that we just launched in Brazil. So if you're interested on hearing about that, we'd love to connect with you. But you made a really good point, and one that I meant to talk about earlier, in the fact that the pollution, marine debris pollution, isn't just an environmental, habitat pollution issue. It's a health issue, and I think it's very important. And it kind of wraps into your point, you need to highlight issues not just from the perspective that you care about. So I'll use, I think, health and pollution as a great example. IUU fishing was a big one. When I started in 2013, it was mainly a environmental impact, fish stock health issue, and we started pushing on highlighting all the national security implications around drug trafficking, arms trafficking, terrorism networks, organized crime, and now of late the labor, seafood, or the human and labor abuses. And that's brought in a ton of members from the middle states who maybe are on armed services or committees that care about these issues. One example being Senator Portman, last Congress from Ohio. He was big on human trafficking because there seems to be some human trafficking networks in Ohio. And so he really then became a pretty big supporter of some of our IUU fishing efforts. So I think taking a second and looking at what other people might care about and having some grace is very important, and I think difficult in this day and age. And no judgment. I tend, if I need a bottle of water and I'm really thirsty and there's no, like, I get a plastic bottle. But I think to that point, the solutions that Ryan's pushing and talking about in terms of deposits, better recycling infrastructure, companies implementing more into their packaging where it's easier to recycle. I live in Montgomery County, and a mile away from me is a different county, and they don't take certain plastics that my county takes, or vice versa, and that's super confusing. But if we can have a system where you can have your water and it can be convenient, but you can put it in the right, that's a whole nother thing, is if you look in a recycling container on the street, if you don't look in it, because there's nothing in there that's recyclable. So there's that public awareness, but definitely it's not helpful to judge people. And I think it's kind of interesting too. I have friends that do this, but they're super passionate about one environmental issue. But then I'll go over to their house for a party, and they've got the red Solo cups. They've got all the I'm like, okay, you're saving the world. So I think we all just need to have a little grace.
I agree with that too. It has to be kind of like a societal shift.
Yeah.
And like DRS, that's going to put in so much infrastructure that would make it so that we can have better recycling, and we can improve and like institute some reuse methods. I know there's some local venues that we've done some events for that are starting to institute reuse at their venues because there's so much plastic waste after, let's say, a concert or a big event. And it's really showing a lot of change there. I also wanted to touch that.
I might have to,
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, we're at the end of our time.
Okay.
I know we could go on all day, and I
Yeah.
think some of you are, but I'm going to go to Becca and Delbert, and then if everybody could stay around for a few minutes afterwards, and we could have a little bit of sideline conversation, that would be great. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah.
Becca, did you want to comment on any of these questions? I think there was one about deep sea mining, thinking about how we make our own personal decisions and help people make better decisions, including not just allowing them to have the infrastructure in place to make better decisions. And any final words?
These have been great questions. You really covered a lot of ground, so it's hard to come up with one theme that will tie them all together, and I want to make sure Delbert has a chance to speak. But I guess I'll say that, fortunately in the Arctic region, seabed mining is a distant prospect, so I don't have to spend too much time worrying about that because it's a very tricky issue set. It's very impactful. But I will say that on some of these issues of common ground, like the issue about polar cruises, or even sort of the plastic bottle issue, I think that we often can connect with folks from across the spectrum. And this is something we deal with every day at the Wilson Center because we are a nonpartisan think tank, and so we work across political aisles, and we connect through telling stories. And I think that's why it's so great that Delbert's here, because when we're talking about climate change in the Arctic region, we're talking about ocean policy, it's those frontline communities that I think folks really respond to people who are living these challenges. And so I think that's been really important in our work. And I think that sort of speaks to the cruise ship issue, right? You can talk to somebody about what's going on in the Arctic region. If they go up there on vacation and see it for themselves, that has a really tremendous impact. And so I'm sort of loath to come down on it because cruises are bipartisan. And so I'll stop there, but I'm happy to keep chatting about this later. Thank you.
Okay. Delbert.
It's on the tourism. I think the best way I could do it is it's like a double-edged sword. As I'm interested in that myself, as long as it's like I heard about this ecotourism, as long as it is environmentally friendly, and the ships that are going through the Arctic not to be using that heavy fuel oil. Why I lean towards it is because of the our food security is at its imminent threat. It is getting really serious for us. The window of opportunity for our harvesting our marine seafood is getting smaller because the winters are coming in late. Winters are coming in early. Late, excuse me. Normally, before Thanksgiving, the whole of the Bering Sea would be completely locked up. It's the polar ice that came and set the winter. The polar ice do not reach us no longer. The only ice we get now is sikulep that's formed as a slush from the ocean floor. It floats up as a slush, and then when it solidifies, then it becomes siku, ice. And so that is the biggest concern, particularly for my people on the island, as opposed to the mainland. They have more resources of subsistence, other activities there. We do have one gentleman by the name of Sheldon Jackson that put the reindeer on our island after the second big famine that struck our island, almost took all of our people, so that we will not experience famine again. And that was a horrific, traumatic event that took place twice on our island, on our historical trauma that is recognized as almost wiped out our island. But the reindeer business, we were wanting to commercialize that too. But something like tourism would be, it brings some income for our people, for the artists, and they come in and they do performance for them, do singing and dancing for them. And as you were saying, that the majority of the world misunderstands our people, don't really know who we are and how we live, and our spirituality, our beliefs, our belief systems. To me, why I support that too is it does gives them a first-hand look and meeting us and get to respect us and to understand us. And yeah, and if I could, on that deep sea mining, we had a 1994 giant corporation from Canada proposed to do mining on our island. That's on our island, the surface. And I was told by my grandfather that I must fight that to protect our island. And that's the only island we got. And if we contaminate it, where are we going to get our subsistence food and so forth? And so I'm proud to say that we were successful in stopping that. He reminded me to remind our people of our spirituality, our belief creator, Mother Earth. And so I had to get a lot of education on that. The Sierra Club from Juneau, I'm thankful for them. They sent me a whole bunch of information free. I told them I'm going to fight this mining industry. Caminco, from a giant corporation from Canada, who operates the Red Dog mine in Kotzebue, which is turning out to be a Superfund site cleanup. And so with all that information, I really studied up on it. And they will say that today they have modern technology. They can, like a doctor, open it up and take out and not disturb anything. That's not the case. It's still the same as when they started over 100 years, 200 years ago. And so the one thing I thought, I might sound like a scientist too, but it's because my grandpa said we were scientists, environmentalists, and conservationists all rolled into one as well. And so I started thinking about this on my trip to London. We met with 200 plus or so scientists, environmentalists, conservationists from all over the world. And I spoke before them, and I was arguing that we all know what the CO2 emissions is the main driver of our atmosphere heating up. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that. And so my thinking, I started thinking, was what is the main driver of our North and South Pole alignment losing its magnetic alignment? And the one thing that's most powerful magnetic force, trillions of miles away, which controls this whole universe. And so, okay, so what is the main driver of the North and South Pole losing its alignment? Well, you could say it's everything, and the unimaginable trillions of tons of Earth that's being used and moved, and altering nature, damming rivers, and so forth. And so I came up with this, and I believe this, and I was speaking before all those scientists and environmentalists, and I said to them, I will argue that the main driver of our North and South Pole losing its alignment is the mining industries. Because when you think about it, especially since the mining industrial revolution began, and in doing at unimaginable scales, and how they can do it in such a short period of time, that, you know, on our Mother Earth, we believe that she gets old, renews herself, she rearranges herself, and followed by Ice Age that's healing and cleansing herself. But the main driver of that, you see, these bodies of wars that they're pulling out from the Earth, they're bodies of wars. Mm-hmm. How did they get put together like that? Mother Earth. Now, all these bodies of wars have magnetic properties. We all know that. And so I've argued that, and I was arguing that, and all the scientists, they're looking at me like, environmentalists, and I was like, oh my, I must be just making nonsense. And so I was arguing that it's the mining industries, the unimaginable trillions of tons of bodies of ore that's being pulled out are destabilizing the Earth's magnetic properties. And so I paused for a moment. I said, am I making sense? And they all said yes at the same time, and they all laughed because they all said yes at the same time, and that made sense. And there was a gentleman by the name of David Gordon who said he was going to do some research on that. So,
well, we'll have to look into it. The critical minerals issue is one that the Wilson Center has been focused on intently, thinking about the role that minerals and rare earths are going to be playing in the renewable energy transition. And so is there a way to move forward and not repeat the mistakes that we've made in the past when it comes to extraction, recognizing the importance of the minerals in that transition and in our sort of global future? And actually, if you don't mind, I'll just put a plug in. On Thursday morning, we're hosting an event here on that very issue, and thinking about how the US and Canada and EU can cooperate to ensure that we're moving forward in a way that is not leaving anybody behind. And I'll say on the deep sea mining issue, I did see recently that there was a research to sort of see what could be possible in terms of deep sea mining. And in that process, they identified like 5,000 new species of fish, right? So, or of marine life. And I think that in and of itself is fascinating and underscores how little we know about the ocean and how much more attention we need to be paying. So on that note, I'm going to thank our panelists. Please join me in thanking our panelists. thank you all for joining us in the room, and thank you for joining us online, and thank you to all of the various teams that really helped to pull together today's event, and good luck with the rest of Capitol Hill Oceans Week.
Good to see you again, Ryan.